This is Matthew Cratter from Bitcoin University, and today I wanted to talk about turning oil into Bitcoin, as well as Hyperbitcoinization, which means the world moving to a Bitcoin standard. And part of this is to answer that question I'm always getting: why would a country ever want to use Bitcoin or touch Bitcoin or have anything to do with Bitcoin? So let's take as an example, let's say you're a country that's rolling in extra cash because you pump and export lots of crude oil. You have various choices what to do with this money, especially when you have a surplus. You could build fancy new cities with lots of AC and desalination plants, as many countries and cities do in the Middle East. You could take that surplus money and invest it in paper that loses purchasing power every year and can be frozen by the U.S. government. In other words, you could invest in U.S. Treasuries, U.S. government bonds, or you could invest it in a hard asset that cannot be censored or devalued, that will hold its value over time. These are three possibilities. And when we're considering these from the perspective of one of these countries or cities, it's important to keep in mind that these oil reserves presumably will not be around forever. There is a depletion rate. One day they will be depleted, and so these countries and cities are going to need to transition their economies to something more sustainable than dinosaur juice. I think Abu Dhabi is a very interesting example. It's the capital, obviously, of the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and they're pursuing all of these different strategies with their excess cash. So they're building new cities, they're building new developments like Masdar City, which looks very interesting, and it's a completely new city that's going to be a mixture of industrial and commercial and residential things. So this is one way of reinvesting in your country or reinvesting in your city. The other thing Abu Dhabi is doing, or United Arab Emirates is doing, I should say, is they are still accumulating lots of U.S. Treasuries, U.S. government bonds. So if we take a look at major foreign holders of Treasury securities, this is put out by the U.S. Treasury every month or so, we can see that United Arab Emirates, UAE, has been growing their amount of treasuries held from 46 billion about a year ago to 64 billion. So this is still quite a large amount of money, especially for a fairly small country, and it's being stored in an asset that is losing value over time. And obviously the political leaders need to ask themselves, why would you ever want to put your hard-earned savings? This is true for individuals, this is true for governments as well. Why would you ever want to put your hard-earned savings into investments that are mathematically guaranteed to destroy your future purchasing power like U.S. Treasuries are? Is this a smart way of preparing your country to eventually run out of oil? And what happens, and this is the big question, what happens if the U.S. gets mad at you, the U.S. government gets mad at you and freezes your U.S. Treasuries and your U.S. dollar bank accounts? And this has happened repeatedly, as we're about to see. But before we turn to that, I'd just ask you to hit that subscribe button to help support this channel's mission if you're not subscribed already. So this is the big problem with holding U.S. Treasuries, whether you're an individual or a corporation or a city or a country, is that the underlying asset, US dollars, the underlying currency, is a melting ice cube. We can look here at CPI inflation, which is much lower than the real rate of inflation. Still fairly high. We can see we're still at about 5%. So if you're holding these treasuries, especially if the yield on them is below the rate of inflation, and the true rate of inflation is probably something double digits, more like something like 10 to 20% in the US at this point, depending on your basket of consumption, you're losing purchasing power. And so it does make a lot more sense, for example, to recycle your oil profits into building new cities than it does to holding these melting ice cubes known as treasuries. As we said, the other problem is that the U.S. periodically gets mad at a new country, decides to freeze its treasuries and its U.S. dollar assets. So this is another risk to holding so many treasuries, to holding $64 billion worth of treasuries. As I understand it, the UAE and the U.S. currently have good relations, but this won't necessarily continue. And it's constantly, I think at one point or another, the U.S. has been enemies with almost every country on the planet. Here's an example of a court, even a United Nations court, refusing to free assets, Iranian assets that were frozen by the U.S. So this is one risk of holding U.S. treasuries, that surely countries like, well, Russia has learned the hard way. China is obviously very worried about this and has been paring back on the amount of U.S. treasuries that they hold. So this, again, is a strong argument for reinvesting those profits into your country rather than holding U.S. paper that can be censored, and that is actively being debased by Fed money printing. Now, the other thing you can do with these excess profits, which is very interesting, and this is what the main point of this video is, Abu Dhabi is now moving to reinvest some of their profits into Bitcoin mining. Here's an announcement that the Bitcoin miner Marathon, which is a U.S. publicly traded Bitcoin mining company, has just partnered with Zero2, backed by Abu Dhabi's $853 billion sovereign wealth fund, to create the Middle East's first large-scale immersion Bitcoin mining operations. You can't use simple AC in the desert. You need to use immersion. But this is very exciting and it's very interesting. I'll link to this article in the description notes below. Marathon gets 20% of the proceeds of the profits, and Abu Dhabi gets 80%. So this is, I think, a very smart use of excess oil profits. And this is, I think we'll see this increasingly around the world, especially for countries that have very long-term time horizons, that are planning for the future, and that they know they're going to run out of oil at some point, or that oil will become a much smaller part of their economy, and they want to make sure that they still have a vibrant and robust economy after this transition has happened. And I think a very smart way of doing that, rather than reinvesting, you can reinvest to a certain extent, build new cities. That runs out after a certain point if you're swimming in cash. And so rather than holding that $50 or $60 billion in US Treasuries, it makes a lot more sense to begin to hold it in Bitcoin. And how do you get a non-KYC Bitcoin? How do you get anonymous Bitcoin? One of the smartest ways is simply to mine it. And I think this is a lot of what's behind Abu Dhabi moving into Bitcoin mining. Even though Bitcoin mining is a very heat-intensive process, it produces a lot of heat. Doing it in the desert is not the ideal place, but it looks like they're going to be able to make it work. I want to contrast this with U.S. policy. The White House is busy attacking Bitcoin miners. For what reason? Because they use electricity, just like electric cars. So if your Tesla uses electricity, that is politically virtuous. But if your Bitcoin mining rig uses electricity, that is a sin, according to the current administration. I'll link to this video in the description notes below, where I talk about the White House trying to impose this 30% electricity tax on Bitcoin miners in the U.S., which would just serve to drive Bitcoin miners elsewhere. It's not going to hurt Bitcoin at all. The other thing the U.S. is doing is it keeps kicking participants off of the U.S. dollar network. So it's kicked off Venezuela, Russia, Iran, North Korea, etc. And you can consider these rogue nations to a certain extent. But one of the things is, if you're running a global monetary network, it's not the smartest thing to keep kicking people off of that network, even if you don't like their politics, even if you don't like their stance toward the U.S. The U.S. should be trying to maximize, if it was smart, maximize people with access and countries with access to the U.S. dollar network. Instead, they're doing the opposite thing. And this has the effect of driving these countries into each other's arms, and also driving them into Bitcoin, for example. So it really makes perfect sense to see countries like Russia, like United Arab Emirates, for example, countries with lots of energy resources, moving their efforts and their savings into Bitcoin. And to the extent that they do this and move it into Bitcoin, those are dollars, those are recycled dollars that are not being recycled into U.S. Treasuries. And so what this is doing is it's slowly undermining the current U.S. dollar system. We talked a couple days ago about Bhutan, the Kingdom of Bhutan, mining Bitcoin for years and years and years. It looks like they're now going to be expanding that. They're partnering with BitDeer to expand Bitcoin mining using their hydro power. So this is another example of a country that is energy rich, in this case in hydro rather than crude oil, using it to mine Bitcoin. These are not countries that are especially fond of Bitcoin. There's nothing special about Bitcoin to the UAE or to the Kingdom of Bhutan, but it's simply, they're just simply pursuing their own self-interest. And this is really the answer to that question. Will countries really allow people to adopt Bitcoin? Why would a country itself want to help support Bitcoin? Well, certainly not out of pure charity and goodwill, but just as a natural consequence, as we've seen in this video, of that country or city or group or corporation or individual pursuing its own self-interest. Right now, there's no longer any good reason for a country to own U.S. Treasuries, especially if it's not a strong ally of the U.S., because these Treasuries, even if it is a strong ally of the U.S., it's not a good investment. These are constantly losing value. They can be frozen, they can be censored, etc. But there are many good reasons: censorship resistance, as being a preserver of purchasing power, in other words, a store of value for both people and corporations and countries to own Bitcoin. And I think this is part of that inevitable path to hyper-Bitcoinization, we see energy-rich countries increasingly moving into Bitcoin. And this is part of how the game theory works and how we get to a global Bitcoin standard. And it's going to happen whether certain countries like the US oppose it or not. At the end of the day, the soundest money will win. I'd like to see the US get on board with Bitcoin and start stockpiling it, creating its own Fort Knox version of it. We'll see whether the US is smart enough to do it or whether it's going to ensure that all the Bitcoin miners and all the Bitcoin ends up in the treasuries of other countries. Again, at the end of the day, it's the soundest money that's going to win, and that's very good news for Bitcoiners from all nationalities and all countries. Bitcoin has already won due to its construction, due to its launch, due to its fundamentals. Bitcoin has already won. It just hasn't been priced into the market yet. And when you understand, you see how countries are moving forward and how the game theory surrounding Bitcoin works, you see how this path to hyper-Bitcoinization really is inevitable. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.